Hello everyone, today is Sunday, 10th of January 2021. I got it right, hooray. Cheers for that. Now, today, one thing I was going to say today is I'm still considering whether my prediction of keeping this thing is going to keep stand or whether it's going to disappear. It's not really growing on me. But one thing I wanted to talk about today is when I was making my last video about making predictions and talking about the age of politicians in power today and where it's gonna all go. Well, I didn't want to talk about something like this for a while, and today I want to expand on the subject. And I'm gonna talk about it not in the space of just today's realities. But what I want to compare it to is actually the time of the fall of Soviet Union. Because there's a lot of parallels we can draw from the situation in politics today towards the situation in politics which happened at the end of Soviet Union. And many people say, oh, you just like Soviet Union too much. It's like, no, really, I didn't live there long enough. But what I can see is the failure of the system in the Soviet Union and how it happened. Why it happened and what it led to. And what it led to didn't come up very pretty. I grew up through this not very pretty. You don't want to do that. So, looking at what I've said in my previous video where I was predicting that within the next few years we're gonna see an American president collapse onto himself during some presidential speech just because he ran out of sand that's been falling out of them for so long, and the whole body just imploded because there was nothing inside to keep it. Thing is, this is actually quite indicative of a lot of, current political systems, in current many modern countries. And it's very indicative also of so-called capitalism. Right, because the capitalism is mostly represented by people in their 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, right? And they cannot connect to modern people because these people, they have lived in the era where capitalism was capitalism versus communism, right? And where people made a mistake, and I do have to admit that at some point of time I did the same mistake, which equated capitalism to a market economy, right? Let's just understand, and I think this is something which many young people feel now, which is capitalism is not equal market economy. Capitalism in its core base is against competition. It's for competition as long as I'm winning it, but as long as I'm on the top, I'm going to do everything I can to screw you over. And that's okay in capitalism. This is why many young people are struggling to connect to the modern capitalism. Right, where modern slave trade, like I say, getting people to work for so little money that European farmers are spending more money on their animals, if a farmer growing a pig, is like he spends on this pig more money in a month than many people spend on their employees. So, and then this is how they end up beating the market. They're not making anything new. They just using cheap slave labor somewhere in a country where they can get away with this. But we also see that, like, the governments of many countries, despite the fact that it's like, yeah, there are some new politicians coming in and they get elected, like the French president who's like nearly 50 now, was in his late 40s. The Canadian president looks really nice, still in late 50s. In late 40s, I don't know, maybe early 50s now. I don't really keep track of him. But a lot of world leaders, they are already in their late 60s, early 70s. Most of the parliaments outside maybe European Parliament, which is why they quite often end up getting a leg up on things. Most of the parliaments are in their like late 50s, 60s, 70s, right? These are the people that grew up in a very different era from most of the population of the countries they are running. And what they're finding is they're not connecting. Like, you have people who still, yeah, you have like small fringes of people who still live in the kind of mindset of the Cold War, even among young population. But to be honest, that is already disappearing. There's more people in the center than there are on the fringes. And most of our politicians, they are either fringes or they're trying to abuse the fringes. I mean, people now talking about, hey, are we gonna have a revolution in US? You know, some people saying, because obviously I'm Ukrainian, so many people might remember the event which is generally called Maidan in Ukraine, which is where people went up into squares and just protested what was happening with the actions of the president in 2004 first, and then in 2014, where it ended up in over 100 people killed by hired guns and police. Right, there's similar things are happening in the other poorer countries as well now, because the people who get into power, they still think in the mindset of that kind of Cold War 20th century, because people who get into power, despite quite often saying the right things, they still think in the ways which have been good in 1981. Or what was Orwell 1985? Whatever was his like Orwell's story, and then the similar way of, I don't know, Animal Farm kind of, you're either with us or you're against us. Like, what we see is that kind of same tricks being used again and again and again. And to be honest, the left, people who are on the left are quite often more inclined to do this. And we see this kind of tactics being used in their ways of trying to keep the argument, and this is why overall they're losing. Like, this is why Trump has won, because not only was the left abusing the situation with them, like, you know, oh yeah, look, we have the lefties in power in these tech giants, right, who still think the same way. You know, they're part of the club, right? And people who grow up in the club, right? People who come into power, they're part of the club. This is why many people went on the side of Trump, because he was not part of the club. And we can compare that to the situation which was in Soviet Union in 1980s, where they were going like, well, if you're not with the party, you're a bad guy. But we definitely need a reform. We don't know how to do it, but unless you are in the party, we don't want to listen to you. Unless you're part of the club, we don't want to hear you. Like, so the kind of ex-communist capitalists, some people that I know will tell me like, capitalism is great. Okay, cool. How are you gonna change this? How are you gonna change the fact that US, the country with 300 million people, cannot produce enough doctors and nurses to run its own hospitals. And this is the country where the doctors actually making the most money apparently in the world. How do you correlate this with the success of capitalism? You can't, because the capitalism is like, once the doctors become the doctors, they go like, well, I'm not really interested in making more doctors because my wages are gonna go down. Fuck you guys, I don't care. That's capitalism. Yeah, he's not directly hurting his patients, but that's a difference because he's not interested in having more doctors. A guy who built a building, right, and now rents this building at $200 per square meter per month. So a 20 square meter place is gonna cost you like I don't know, $4 a month. Is not interested in building more better buildings. He's not. And because not many buildings have been built, the few companies that actually build these buildings are not interested in having more competition and more companies that can build the buildings existing. No, because because if there's only like two companies that do this, pretending they're in competition, right? Same thing was happening in the Soviet Union. Right? They were like, yeah, we want to change the country. We don't know how we're gonna do it, but as long as you're part of the club, you can say something. But you're not part of the club, and the club by the 80s. Let's be honest, most of the people in the Communist Party club that were running the country, they were in their late 60s, 70s, early 80s, same kind of age as our politicians are today. And it gets even worse because what we see is the people who are getting into the power on the back of these old geezers are the people who are part of the club. And where it gets worse, like the same thing happened in Soviet Union, right? The Gorbachev that became the leader of Soviet Union by the end of the 80s, he was part of the club. He hasn't had a clue what the fuck he was doing, but he was part of the club. And the club was like, okay, we're trying to achieve this. It's like, how do we do this? We don't know. We have no people in here who have any other ideas except ours. We don't want to hear from them. You see the same thing in politics, in UK, right? Even the people who are like against, like, what was it, his Jeremy Corbyn, the guy who was like against the thing. I mean, yeah, he acted like he's not part of the club, but he was there for what, good 50 years? And imagine the guy's like in his late 70s, right? He's going into parliament around 30 years old. It's 40 years. Somebody's gonna tell me he ain't part of the club. What the fuck is he doing there then? Right? Everybody talks about how they have let him, like in US, what was it, Bernie Sanders guy? The guy is 80 years fucking old. He's been there in that parliament again for 50, 60 years. How the hell did he get elected and renominated time after time after time after time to be there for that time if he was against the club? I mean, these people, like, at least he was, like, somebody expressing different opinions for the matter of appearances. Yeah, great. You know, the guy like, who do we send to talk to IRA from the British Parliament? Well, let's send this guy who's like, you know, he's the fall guy for everything. That's probably it. And the fact that these people are like trying to now appeal to the, well, young and progressive crowd further shows that these people haven't got any clue. Same way as the Communist Party, they were like, we're trying to be progressive when they were pulling the Soviet Union to complete shit. They were trying to be more progressive. They've been trying to relate to this cool crowd, the young crowd, which still haven't had a fucking clue what they wanted and didn't understand how shit works. They were appealing to them. This is why people in Soviet Union went out and voted over, I think, close to 90% of population of Soviet Union has voted to dissolve Soviet Union. Just thinking to that figure, 90% of the population, the people who are not on the fringes of anyone, voted to dissolve the country. Probably the last honest vote in the territory of ex-Soviet freaking Union. And look at this movements, like, you know, in US, they are essentially using fringes, and they are staying on the fringes of the politics to shut out around 80% of the population from the conversations. Right, the same old tricks which worked in, I don't know, in 1990s, 1980s, they're trying to pull them now because they have no idea how society works today, because they're that far away from it. Like, their best years ended in 2000. Right, once you're 60 years old, guys, maybe it's time to move on. Right, they don't understand that by switching somebody's Twitter account, you're not really making any progress. What it does is they just move on onto a different platform, which there's a dozen of them. And many of these platforms are supported by people who don't give a shit about Twitter. Hell, most of them are not on Twitter anyway because they're banned there. Most of the people who will listen for them are going to be people who haven't got a clue what Twitter is. Their imagination of the modern world, same as it was changing in the 1980s and end of 1980s, where Soviet Union came to the stage where, look, you know, we can't continue on the way it is. Things are changing. There's a completely new people already grown up. For them, the last war happened like 50 years ago. We really respect the people who won the war, but we have already completely different set of ways of doing things, completely different set of desires. You know, like where if it's in Soviet Union, like people who ran Soviet Union, they could not imagine that, hey, somebody can make a tape and people can copy it over time and time and time again. You know, they gave people the means of listening to the music, right? Whereas in Soviet Union, you couldn't do it. Right? It started in the 70s with the introduction of new technologies. New music came in. They could not imagine that, hey, we can print 20 copies of a book on one printer in less than a day. So forbidding books didn't work anymore. Like in Soviet Union, Lord of the Rings was a banned book. You couldn't print it. That's why it goes passed over from person to person. They would read it and pass it on to another one, or type it up on a computer which were available in many places, and then print them on a dot matrix printers as well. So you could get this book with a dot matrix printer paper. And it would last for about 3 years before like a few hundred people read it, and then it completely dissipated. They didn't understand that then. Right now, these people don't understand because they live in that time. They don't understand that it's not just one or two platforms anymore. Yeah, you can have a big platform, but people can move on. As many people who I know who've been banned on YouTube, for example, they still produce content. And then it's just been they produce it on a different platform, and then somebody else and the different name says, hey, it's produced on that platform, but because I know that people on YouTube are still interested, I'm gonna put it under different name. When people talk about the recent events in the US where people have apparently stormed some government building, right, and people died, unfortunately, right, and the people who were setting stores on fire, even though they made some fair criticism where they said, hey, why is it that when we were making some protests, there were like thousands upon thousands of the police, and when these guys have made some protests, there was only 20 cops in there. Well, yeah, probably because nobody ever expected that these guys are actually going to wander into a building. And, well, again, some stuff you hear from other branches of internet which will like, hey, there's people in there speaking very good Russian and who seem to be organizing the most aggressive part of this people who are entering the building. I didn't see the video. I'm not gonna say whether it was or it wasn't, but it seems to be the case. Give me a second, please. Sorry, I'm back. So, okay, now there's people who are organizing the protests. In both cases, they were instigators of bad behavior. Right, but again, we see only the fringes. Just to give you a comparison, at the end of Soviet Union, when people voted to break it apart, the actual movement from the people which are not on the fringe, they were the base of the country. There were multi-million protests against the government, which had no clue what the fuck it was doing. Give you another comparison. In Ukraine, just recently, 2014, the total amount of people which took part in the protests is going on the active part, like people who are like didn't just turn up there for a day and just said, yeah, we support you. But the total amount of people that actually took active part was nearly 30% of the country, was over 10 million people in the country of 40 million. Over 10 million people took part, active part, where they would protest for days at a time and take part in active actions on blocking extra police involvement, on taking over the roads, stopping over any sort of criminal activity that was the government, any criminal gangs the government tried to pull into the Kiev. There was over 10 million people, right? Third of the country, close to half of the country. In US, it doesn't happen. In UK, again, if we see any sort of like big actions, yeah, you get a few thousand people. But in a country which has got 60 million population, it's nothing. And yet, the politicians that are pulling shit, they are still thinking, they're still the age where they're still thinking in the 1990s kind of way of thinking. Let's lie. Yeah, okay, cool. Sometimes it works. Like Brexit is a great example where they lied and they did manage still to divide society. And again, that is all running on the back where there's a big part of society is over 50 years old. Let's just remember that the biggest voting part of the people, they are on the age of over 40, unlike previous generations. And this is why they're increasingly scared, for example, of any proper secondary votes on Brexit. Because in these few years, many people that actually voted Brexit, they simply passed away. It's a sad fact, but the fact nevertheless, many people who voted for Brexit are already dead. And we're talking about just 4 years. We're talking about people who are still sitting in the parliament. Same thing as was happened in the Soviet Union. The people that were sitting in the Soviet parliament, people which were doing like reading reports, had figures. They were like very, very, very old. They were still talking about how many more tanks do we need. When people were like, I don't care about tanks. Really, like, we have 50,000, 60,000 tanks. Oh, we have more tanks than entire Europe. Well, maybe it's fucking enough. Maybe let's stop building tanks and start building ladders. I mean, ladders are pretty shit. So people knew that they were pretty shit. But they were like, well, maybe some more ladders would be fine. There was a very nice car which everybody liked, was Niva. Like everybody, probably first crossroader as a model, first car which was built as a crossroader. So it's like, wasn't an off-roader, it wasn't just a tarmac place, it was something which you can use on both sides. People liked them. They didn't want to build another 20,000 tanks. They wanted another 20,000 Nivas. They didn't want that. They didn't desire for the best engineers to produce the next best plane in the world and then build another like 10,000 planes which they never thought are going to be used. Because the country had so much nuclear weapons that they were enough to destroy an entire freaking planet. But nobody was going to invade Soviet Union, nobody cared. And so the people, they didn't see themselves as fighting some capitalist guy somewhere in France. They didn't give a shit. They just wanted to have an opportunity to go and visit Eiffel Tower. Because many of them had actually a reasonably good education. That's what we're getting now, is we're getting a fight against education where people increasingly get educated by not being educated, by simply reading things online, by simply being able to communicate with other people, by simply getting introduced to the ideas. And this is why the people who are in the parliaments who still think, oh, we're fighting this or we're fighting that, it's like they're losing. And they're dying out. They still have the power, but This is why we see so much people, for example, supporting Trump. Because despite whatever people tried to say about him, he was talking the language people understood. He was not part of the club. He was one of the people who works with normal people. Yeah, he's not very articulate. He does a very good job of destroying himself. But people sure understood him better than the other guys. Right? And what we see, for example, in Ukraine, the last president of Ukraine, again, that guy was never supposed to win an election. The guy wins an election because he says pretty much the same stuff that the other guy does, but he says them in such a way that, hey, you know what, guys, I can relate to this person. He seems to understand me, but this person, he seems to say shit which I don't understand. He seems to talk in ideas which were like cool like 20 years ago. Sure, they don't always agree on something. Some things they say don't always connect, and we understand that. But look at that. Look at Japan, for example, as well. Great example. Like the parliament sitting there, the prime minister is like 60 something years fucking old. Like, he's trying to fight the things in the ways which he has been taught in 19 fucking 80s. Stuff has changed. And changing increasingly on increasing pace. These people cannot run things if they're trying to run them with the ideas from when they were my age. And I'm freaking 40. Just recently again looking at the kind of leaders of the industry. The guy running Toyota, the guy who's like again in his like 60s, close to 70, says, why is it that modern guys don't want to buy cars anymore? Don't they see the car as a status symbol? It's like, no, they don't. It's like, I'm 40 years old. I'm like, no, I don't. And I grew up at the time, like I say, when I owned Vauxhall Nova, when Vauxhall Nova was a cool car to own. But I see a car as a comfort, as something I used for work for a very long time. I really enjoy driving cars. But I'm as happy to rent a car once a month and go for a drive over paying the same money just for the car to stand there outside my flat. People have other worries as well. The worries that people have changed, including thanks to the leadership of these people who are now claiming to be world leaders, sitting there in their 70s, 80s, not understanding whatever the fuck people are facing, right? They don't understand. To try to explain to somebody who's like 60 something years old, who has bought his house 20, 25 years ago, when a four bedroom house costed less than 3 times your basic average wage. Like I said, the average wage was like 20K a year, for example, and a 4 bedroom house costed less than 60 grand. And try to explain to this person that a modern guy just coming out of university will never be able to pack away enough money to buy a house on an average wage in his lifetime. Not 3 years worth of the wage, Because an average 3 bedroom, 4 bedroom house with an average wage of, let's say, I'll give credit to some places like, the US, let's say an average wage is we're gonna put in all the billionaires in there, where the average wage is 50 grand. And a 4-bedroom house costs what? 400K? 22 less than 60, 2.5 times the minimum basic wage, right? To 5, 6, 7 times the average wage. And I'm giving a very generous average wage. These people don't understand it, they don't get it. Many people I know who are very nice people, but when they come to the subjects like this, they call themselves scientists, they call themselves engineers, they call themselves as someone who understands numbers. These are the numbers they are, or many of them actually, like the late age stages on the left, they don't understand these numbers. They go like, wait a minute, I'm making like 150 grand, and it's like, it's okay for me to buy this house. Like, great, mate. But like, you're 65, you're 70 years old, if you're making all this money, if you're also fucking rich, why don't you leave your job, get the fuck out into your retirement, and leave some space for the younger people to come in? Oh no, I wouldn't do that because I really like my wage. Like, well, that's capitalism, mate. You don't want to step away. You like your place. You won the race. Which means that you staying in this place means that the 20-year-old that you have been when you started your jobs, right, is still sitting on a minimum wage. It means that the 30-year-old is not getting even 50 grand. He'll be lucky to get 30, 40. Because they're waiting for you to move on. And the people in government, they don't get it. Same as people in the government in Soviet Union, they didn't get it. So despite the fact that all those, they were looking at things from like, those were the socialists, so-called socialists. These are the people who like so-called capitalists, right? They say, we're capitalists, like, which has nothing to do with market economy, let's be honest, right? Because again, a young engineer who's full of ideas, it's probably better to promote than a guy who's in his like late 60s, who should probably be retired or put on somewhere where he can let new ideas come in. I have full respect for all the guys. You've done your dues, you paid your dues, you've done your job, you kept it. Cool, there's plenty of things you can do outside and maybe even reignite some other ideas you might have. But now we have a bunch of people sitting there running things which are like, oh my god, people like, when will you shift on? The British because in Britain, for example, they have 2 levels of parliament, and if in the lower level, the actual parliament, we can see at least some movement. So sometimes younger people do come in. I'm hoping there's going to be more of them. Right, very much the Lords, the Chamber of Lords, what they have, and there's like this, like most of the people there, they're like they're going to be hitting hundreds soon. And again, with all the respect, due respect to the older people, but the Chamber of Lords has become so big, so enormous, because it was never calculated that having a few thousand people in there, which just wouldn't fucking die, it was always considered, hey, the Lords are going to be like so many, and they're going to be responsible for certain things, and we just want to hear their input because they're the most influential people in the country in a way. Not anymore, they're not. The people from the time that the oldest member of the Chamber of Lords entered. We're expecting probably a couple more thousand people have joined that part. It's just ridiculous. How these people can decide anything on the modern, how can they be understanding of the modern way of life if they have spent most of their time being a member of the club, same as they did in Soviet Union. Many people by the mid 80s that were in the party, and I believe when I made a program, made a video about talking about Soviet Union, I did mention that there were many people who literally gone up in ranks through the party, and they gone up in ranks not because they were super successful. They were not the people who like, dude, we gave you this job, you're not a member of the party, right? But you have done such a great job. So how about we're gonna make you a member of the party and we're gonna put you in the parliament because you're just so great at this job and you can just the things, the ideas you can bring with you to this kind of is gonna really help us advance. That didn't happen. It's the same thing we see with the political systems in the modern world now in Europe and US and Canada. Many of these guys, at least they went through the club. Fair enough, in many European countries, for example, the club has learned their lessons a long time ago and is trying to keep the balance, but quite often is not aware of how to keep it. Because the members of the club are not the members who are dealing with real life shit. They're the members of the club, that's it. That's the American, British, and many other political systems. You want to see the systems where the members of the club dealing with real life shit? Look at Netherlands. Okay? By far always leading many places. Why? Because many members of the club are the old blood business owners. They understand that their businesses need good, calm, confident employees. Right? So they solve the problems which people face because they are part of the business. And the guy who sits and represents them in the parliament is also a member of the club. But he's the member of the club who's going to the club on a bus, not in a private jet. Okay? And they understand that they want safe streets. They understand that if you put half of your population in a position where they can complete school, what you will get is murderers, thieves, drug addicts, drug sales, whatever, right? And these people sooner or later is gonna come knocking on your door, which means that your currency is gonna go to shit, all your savings gonna go to shit. You will not be able to move whatever valuables you have to any other country, or because all the stuff you own is gonna go to shit, and nobody's gonna really care. Right, yes, many clubs in Europe are more better at introducing younger blood, which are people, but if you look at the biggest places, yeah, it still works on a point of old club boys sitting there having no fucking clue how to solve the problems. And yes, some of them, they say the right things, but if you look at their actions, you go like, you know what? If you were so good at what you're doing, you'd either be on the top or you wouldn't be in a club. They would throw you out. And we don't have people like this. Both Jeremy Corbyn, both whatever the American guy's name anymore, Sanders, most of them, they say they say interesting things like, oh yeah, cool, we want people to live better. Great, great. How are you gonna achieve that? Right, this is the question the Communist Party in Soviet Union could never answer. They said, oh, we want people. Well, how are you gonna achieve that? And the answer was like, well, we just want people to live better. Right? Oh, they say, well, we want to remove all the what's it called? Racism, right? We want to remove racism from the world. Okay, how are you gonna achieve that? And their answer is like, anybody, even if we like think that somebody thought something racist, we're gonna tell everybody that they are a bad person. We're gonna attack them from any way possible. We're gonna shun them. We're gonna block them on TV. We're gonna we're gonna speak to all the TV stations. Okay, cool. You guys are sitting, so you guys are super hyperactive, super active. Okay, great. Why would you do this? Well, because it worked before. Because it worked in 1979. All right, guys, but 1979 is more than 40 years ago. Shit has changed since then. Right? That's the example. This is why Antifa is not winning anymore. This is why more and more people get to hear, like, I don't know, Ben Shapiro, for example. Because, yeah, you can cause mayhem and stuff like this, but all it does is just puts this person, like, you can write to YouTube that, hey, we all offended by Ben Shapiro. And some old fart sitting somewhere in the TV network which says, yep, show these guys who are offended by Ben Shapiro, make them look like good boys. Right, and some journalist says, well, actually, I don't want to do this. Well, I'm the boss. If you want to be part of the club, you want to continue working as a journalist, do what I tell you. The journalist goes like, okay, cool, great. And then he goes like, and he sees some people doing their own journalistic stuff, having their own YouTube channels. They see Joe Rogan being bought up for $100 million. He goes like, And so he starts writing some stuff for some on the side piece of website, which is actually closer to what his thoughts really are. And he writes there, you know what, this Antifa guys, it's like kind of shit. And what he gets is all the people that were like banned from YouTube for saying, for example, let's just say, oh, there's lots of murders in Africa. There's lots of black on black, I'm not going to go to Africa, okay. There's lots of black on black crime, for example, in London. And this is a problem, right? And he's being deemed by all these people as a racist, right? So, okay, this guy goes, okay, well, I'm going to say, and then he reads an article in this weird newspaper, this weird news site, where he wrote in, for example, what is happening with black on black crime in London? Is anything being done about it? And he reads this article. He goes like, and he says something like this, and he's been told again that he's a racist. People tried to get him out of the club because he disagrees with something they say. And they say that there is no black on black crime in London, and you go like, that don't make any fucking sense. I've been to London. I know London. There's lots and lots and lots and lots of great people of every race, color, language, every background, every frame of thinking. But nevertheless, right, there has been a problem of black on black crime, kids getting involved into this gang culture, you know, not having anywhere to go because all the public centers are closed. Any sort of sports they could do are not there anymore because they are either overpriced to the point where their family can't afford it, or they've been shut down completely because they used to be supported by the government. That stuff is gone now, right? They end up hanging around the streets. End up getting pulled into the gangs, and obviously, violence happens in the games, in the gangs. Same as in US. Is it the fault of black people? No. But the violence is still a problem, and the person who talks about this gets shunned because it offends some white middle class or higher up class who wants to sing pink ponies that shit unicorn rainbows. Well, it doesn't happen, but it offends them. And you're not part of the club, so you're a bad guy. That's the politicians today. And when people say that, but in US and in UK there's two parties. In UK there's even three. In France probably more. In Germany there's like a dozen parties. Okay, cool. I agree with that. It's just if that stuff is happening, why is it that we don't really see the actual action from the other parties which are part of the club? Yeah, they can have some different ideas, but in reality what we see is that majority of these people are part of the club. Right, when I was finding myself in a weird situation where I had to defend Trump, who I don't really like on personal level, but I was having to say, look guys, the stuff which you saying is a complete BS. Right, I was like, wait a minute, why is this happening? And then I understood that it's the same as what was happening in Soviet Union in the 1980s. If you're not part of the club, and you are not saying this shit the club has approved, you're the bad guy. New ideas are not coming in. And the problem is that despite the fact that the club is quite often claiming the so-called socialist ideas, if you look at their actions, like, okay, I'm gonna talk about now probably more England and US and some parts of Europe. Europe is not universal because, like I said, in some countries there are clubs which understand the value of humans to their own development. But the clubs in the US and UK, because they're sitting on top of those people who are there, not only like run, but they don't have an input of people that are not part. They have not, they don't have an influx of new blood. They only have the people who went up through the club, not the outsiders' input. These clubs, often the actions they produce, give out the result of actual so-called capitalism. Again, capitalism is not part of market economy. Capitalism is a separate thing. Let's just divide them. It's not a market economy where the best actually progress and win these days. It's an economy of, I know you, can you give me a nice job? Oh, you failed at this job? Okay, cool, we're gonna get you another one. We're gonna grow you within the club because you've been actually good. You've been always like following the club line. And the club line over the last, I would say 40 years, has been a destruction of lower and middle classes, which in return leads to quite often gullible population, which is not properly educated and which will grab onto any ideas which seem to promise them any improvement in their lives. It also leads to the fact that the club itself is not being challenged, so no new ideas are being developed, no new understandings are being developed. No, they cannot follow the times as they used to before. Because let's be honest, the guy being that is 80 years old, for whom the, let's say, again, an idea of basic minimum income has always been a fallacy, he is not capable of actually appreciating these ideas. I have watched a program of, they were asking questions from Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg. And whoever wrote those questions have written them very smartly, and they knew what they were talking about. Unfortunately, the people who were asking those questions could not follow up on those questions. And I'm going to represent you right now. Before I finish, a little story of a big lie Mark Zuckerberg has given when he was talking to the Congress of US. Oops. And he was asked a question. Can WhatsApp, the application which is developed by Facebook, can it read the messages that people send to each other? So can Facebook have access to those messages? And Mark Zuckerberg point blank looked into people's eyes and said no. And they said, "Are you sure?" And he said, "You do not understand what you're talking about, sir." I'm gonna go into my British type. Probably gonna fail, but you do not understand what you're talking about, sir. Facebook application is not made to track what you're talking about in your private conversation, and we would never do anything like it. Okay, so everybody, including some people I know who actually studied computer science, went on to say, we see how Mark Zuckerberg has just gave a kick into these old guys who don't understand technology. It's like, well, what Mark Zuckerberg did is he lied point blank to the people who do not understand technology. He lied under oath. Mark Zuckerberg should go to jail just on that case alone. For in US, lying under oath is a criminal offense for which people should be sent to jail. They are not, because then quite a few politicians would have to be sent to jail. But that's a different story. But nevertheless, Mark Zuckerberg has lied under oath not only to US Senate Commission, but also to every US citizen that uses Facebook or WhatsApp. Let me explain something to you. In technology, the way WhatsApp works is when you first time call your friend, it generates an encryption key, like a password. And using this password, right, the communication between the two, you and your friend, can continue. Right, and without this password, none of you will be able to read the messages. Right? But what happens when you get a new phone? Let's say you lost the old one. right? You go to WhatsApp and you say, hey, May, hello, yeah, I've lost my phone, so right, I'm re-establishing the connection with you. Now, in both cases, both you and your friend will have different passwords, so you will not both have the same password. It's laws of encryption. We're not going to go into them. Where from do you think you get the right passwords to read all your old messages that you send to each other, if not from Facebook servers? Right now, I have WhatsApp running on my phone and on my computer. Do you really think that these passwords are not kept somewhere else? Do you really think that those keys are not kept somewhere on the servers? Facebook servers? Did he tell us as much? I mean, at least Skype people, they were honest. They say, yeah, we technically can read every message you send to each other. But if the law enforcement wants to have access to these keys, they have to go through a very lengthy legal procedure. For each time, they need to get access to every key. We're not giving you, like mother key or whatever, which can read everything. No. You want to listen to this? You give us the code order. Same things can be said about Facebook, WhatsApp. It works on exactly the same principles. So, and Mark Zuckerberg has lied to these people, but because they did not understand the technologies involved, they had no idea how it works. I mean, fair enough. Quite a few normal people don't understand how it works, but they have some inkling. The people who grew up with the modern technology and use it on day-to-day basis and understand it, they would have asked the right questions. They would have had an idea of which questions to ask next. The 70-year-old guy could not press that advantage that he had because he did not have the idea what questions to ask next. There you go. Just a very basic example of how people that do not understand, people who still live in the past, can destroy the future. On an example of Soviet Union, we've seen where it leads. We've seen people, 80% of people, voting to destroy an entire country based on bad acts, bad actions, and outright lies of many people who were in the club and had no idea what they were doing and no idea what they were talking about. Same as the bacon oven deal from Boris Johnson in England. Same as 500 million pounds that were promised to British NHS in case of Brexit. Same as destruction of British NHS over the last 30 years through a bunch of incompetent decisions by people who haven't had a clue how things are run. And increasing active destruction of NHS by people who think they can make it better by making it capitalist. Increasingly bad decisions by a bunch of governments when it comes to dealing with corona crisis, a panic of people who haven't got a clue how modern society works and how little modern people have. All of that is really a very good example increasingly worsening example of the things that were in Soviet Union in the end of 1980s. At least in the end of 1980s, the Soviet Union had a working system which managed to keep at least some balance, and they still fail. What will happen to so-called modern countries unless things start to change? I'm not taking upon myself to predict. All I'm just hoping for is that this generation of politicians is just gonna fucking die. Because I'm not expecting them to put in a resignation note. So I just hope they just gonna fucking die. Otherwise, what we will see is not just the crumbling of Russia, where they have the same problem now as well, where there's tons of so-called politicians, members of the club, who are no younger than 60 plus years old. What we'll see is a crumbling of an entire thing where nobody knows how to pick up the bits and pieces. And I hope we got the systems in place which is going to keep us together instead of shooting missiles at each other. Right, well, again, this is my look at so-called age politics and, trying to compare it to the past. Maybe I didn't do a very good job. God knows. But I wish you all guys have a good night. I hope you have something to think about and maybe someone to choose to vote for next time. As long as it's not me. I don't want to pay that bag. I don't want to pay that bag of fighting cats anywhere near it. But I hope you got somebody else to vote for. And when the next election comes, you're not gonna just take part in the final bit, but you're gonna come to your parties and say, "Hey, we want this guy." Okay, so that to move away from this old bunch of crazy people who should be really in a retirement home instead of a government home. Okay? Thank you very much. Have a good one. Goodbye.